Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. In this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, we're joined by Dr. Brendan Gallagher to talk about his book, The Day After: Why America Wins the War But Loses the Peace. The title actually comes from a quote from President Obama in relation to Gaddafi's loss about there was no plan for what to do the day after. The book explores the question that the title suggests. America has been enormously successful in the battlefield aspects of its military endeavors, but has struggled mightily over the last 2 decades to find lasting political solutions that are acceptable to all parties after the conflict is ended. As Dr. Gallagher says in the introduction, this is a book about an uncomfortable subject. Why does the most powerful nation in the world achieve triumphant military victories but botch nearly everything that comes next? One of the themes of Texas National Security Review is connecting scholarship with the work of practitioners. And no author could be better positioned to do that than Dr. Gallagher, because Dr. Gallagher is also Lieutenant Colonel Gallagher, a career Army infantry officer who recently relinquished successful command of 1st Battalion, 50th Infantry. Colonel Gallagher and I were together in the Security Studies program at the Woodrow Wilson School, where he earned his PhD, and this book is a product of the dissertation. Dr. Gallagher's views, of course, are his own and do not represent the views of the Department of Defense, the Department of the Army, or any unit of the Army. Brendan, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for inviting me, Doyle. I appreciate the opportunity.
Can you outline for our readers what the main argument of your book is? Why does America win the war but lose the peace?
So this book grew out primarily out of my experiences overseas in Iraq and Afghanistan. And on occasion, things, sometimes things are busy and then other times things quiet down a bit. And when things quiet down, sometimes you have an opportunity to kind of reflect and think about things and to think about, how did we get here? And when you think about things in the big picture, in some cases, these conflicts start out with very high hopes, very optimistic speeches by our national leadership about all the glorious things that we plan to accomplish. And then fast forward just a few years later, and we find violence and insurgencies and casualties and significant economic costs to U.S. reputation or standing on the world stage. And so why does this happen and how does this happen? And if it happened just once, for example, in Afghanistan, you might chalk it up as, well, maybe that's just a one-off. It's a one-time thing. But the issue is it's happened repeatedly in places like Afghanistan, and then in Iraq, and then in Libya, and now it becomes to seem like a pattern. And so this is something that I wanted to explore. And so I started to dig into a lot of the primary documents, some of the original post-war planning documents, NSC meeting transcripts, to try to put the pieces together and figure out why are we so good at the initial military campaign, at toppling the regime, and then seemingly so not good at managing everything that happens next. And what I found is that there's a fundamental tension that tends to undercut our efforts again and again. And specifically, we're kind of pulled in 2 different directions. On the one hand, we want to create a democracy in our own image. And this kind of goes back to the Wilsonian idea that the U.S. should promote democracy, that we are a beacon for the rest of the world, and that is our kind of unique responsibility, is to advance the march of democracy across the globe. And so when a regime is toppled, a natural kind of knee-jerk American response is, okay, well, yeah, let's create a new democracy in our own image. So that's one tendency. But on the other hand, there's also another tendency we have, which is essentially to pull out and withdraw at the soonest opportunity. And this relates to other American experiences. For example, in Somalia, in Vietnam, and of course, more recently in places like Iraq. And the idea is, hey, we need to hand this off to somebody else, anybody else, so we can concentrate on other things, concentrate on nation building here at home. And the challenge is when we try to do both of those things at the same time, when you try to create a new democracy and you try to withdraw at the soonest opportunity, now you end up with a very incoherent approach. And one hand's not talking with the other. And essentially what we've had in Afghanistan and then Iraq and Libya is an incoherent approach to the post-war. So the regime is toppled, it's out of the picture, and now we have different parts of the U.S. government trying to do different things without any overall coherence. And I would suggest that this is what helps set the stage for the unfortunate outcomes that have unfolded since then.
Sure. I'm reminded, and you reference Dominic Tierney's work in your book, but his comment basically that America doesn't fight wars, we fight crusades, and that we have this very high-minded goal, but then we very rapidly become frustrated with it and seek to move on to something else or something different. You identify 3 principal planning tasks that you argue, if these are done and done well, are more likely to result in a successful post-war environment and transition. What are those tasks?
So the 3 tasks, the first one is a clear, achievable goal. So in other words, not a wish list of a laundry list of things we would like to happen or wish would happen, but a clear, realistic, achievable, and sustainable goal for the long term. That's the first element. The second is an understanding of the obstacles and difficulties that could get in the way, with an effort to mitigate those obstacles and difficulties. Not necessarily to eliminate them altogether, but some effort to grapple with the most likely ones that could emerge. And then the third and final one is to mobilize resources that align with your goal. And I suggest that if we have these 3 elements in place, if we put actual, brain power and energy into those 3 elements, that we don't guarantee success by any stretch, but we at least start to increase the odds or increase the likelihood of a better outcome than would otherwise unfold.
Yeah, when I read those tasks, I was actually reminded of the excellent book by Lieutenant General James Dubik, Just War Reconsidered, where he talks about waging war justly as a moral obligation. And you invoke again in your introduction and also in the quote from President Bush that introduces the Afghanistan section of the idea of a moral obligation. And Dubik's argument is that aligning processes and resources to achieve appropriate aims actually becomes a part of the moral obligation that we have as we're engaging these wars. So I found that very interesting, the parallel between your work and his there. You also, though, in addition, these planning goals are important and these will make a difference, but you also talk about why it is that it's so hard to do these things well, and you identify a number of pathologies. Can you share with us what those are?
Yeah, so there are the bottom line is all of this is hard. It sounds easy. The 3 aspects that I just mentioned sound easy, but it's extremely difficult because there are these countervailing forces and these pathologies that tend to get in the way and make all of this much, much more difficult. So the first one I talk about is essentially magical thinking. The notion that we can accomplish everything we want to do with very little price to pay. We can create a democracy on the cheap, and it's going to be great. It's going to be quick. It's going to be fast, and we'll get out of there quickly, and it'll be a Western-style democracy. Everything is great. So the kind of magical thinking allows us to surmount the seemingly impossible scenarios. So that's one aspect. Another, it has to do with learning, and I talk about shallow learning. We tend to focus on recent negative events. So, we burn our hand on the stove 5 minutes ago. We focus very intently, like a laser beam, on that event, to the expense of other events, both positive and negative, which might in some ways bear similarities and have differences with the current scenario that's unfolding. But in other words, our learning tends to be very shallow, very narrow, instead of using the breadth of experiences that we could build upon. Another pathology I talk about is underuse of the National Security Council. We tend to not leverage that to its maximum capability. And I suggest that if we are going to create a relatively coherent post-war strategy, the National Security Council is probably the most suitable body to do that. But we routinely tend to undercut or circumvent the NSC rather than to leverage it. And then finally, I talk about cross-cutting U.S. domestic political pressures. There are pressures for us both to promote democracy. On the one hand, that's kind of a natural expectation of the American people. But then on the other side, there's also very strong pressure to quickly get out. Let's bring the troops back home by Christmas or whatever the case may be, and focus on other pressing priorities. And so these pathologies tend to make an already difficult situation that much harder.
Sure. Now, In order to apply both your theory of the planning tasks and to look for evidence of the pathologies, you look at 4 cases. And the first one that you look at is the one that you define as a qualified success, and that's the U.S. intervention in Kosovo. So can you walk us through what made that successful and how it managed to avoid those pathologies?
Absolutely. So Kosovo is interesting. I would say it's somewhat forgotten in a lot of the everyday discourse on conflicts over the past generation or so. Kosovo and the Balkans in general, I would suggest, doesn't probably get quite as much attention as it deserves. The first thing I would say, though, is Kosovo, I will readily acknowledge, was easier in several ways than places like Afghanistan or Iraq. It's easier in that it was smaller. It's smaller in geography, smaller in population. It's located in Europe, and so that could help kind of mobilize NATO's interest for a longer duration. So there's natural aspects that certainly made it easier, but it's still far from easy. There are century-old ethnic animosities. There's outside actors like Russia and Serbia that might very well try to undo any post-war settlement, and other difficulties. So easier, but still quite difficult, and still a lot of ways that it could have unraveled very quickly. And I suggest in the book that the Clinton administration built on its experiences throughout the 1990s, and what I refer to as almost a school of hard knocks. It's its experiences in Somalia and Haiti, the decision not to intervene in Rwanda, and then Bosnia. All these experiences, not all of which went smoothly at all. In some cases, the Clinton administration got embarrassed and kind of got its nose bloodied, figuratively speaking, a few times there. But they learned from those experiences, and basically the takeaway was the post-war is going to be hard. Things are not naturally going to come together. We can't go into this with rose-tinted glasses and think that all is just going to magically come together. This is going to be difficult. And so they focused on the end state. They focused on, the idea that the conflict itself is just the first part. We need to put together something that is rigorous and that can endure from a political standpoint, a security standpoint, economic standpoint. And they actually did that. I walked through the different pieces as far as having a clear, achievable goal, grappling with the potential difficulties that could arise, and then mobilizing the appropriate resources. And I don't suggest that Kosovo is an out-and-out success in every sense of the term, but I do suggest that it was a tolerable, reasonably acceptable outcome. And in these types of kind of messy internal conflicts that we find ourselves in, that's probably just about the best that we can shoot for.
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me about the Kosovo example is the difference between the quality and the depth of the planning for the post-war period and the way in which the campaign itself was conducted. And you allude to this a little bit in the book. I was serving at the time as a special assistant to Admiral Ellis, who was the commander of the U.S. JTF, and I recall General Clark, the commander, the night before the bombing began, telling the commanders to hit as many targets as they could on the ATO because he thought he could hold the NATO military committee together for 24 to 48 hours, but he wasn't going to guarantee anything after that. And of course, as we know, it wound up being a 78-day campaign. And you identify a turning point in it in which the war part of it seemed to get a shot in the arm in terms of the commitment from the political leadership. Where was that?
Yeah, the NATO anniversary summit, the 50th anniversary that occurs a few weeks into the conflict, I think was a key turning point. Up until then, there was kind of a lukewarm sense of commitment by the administration and particularly by the president himself. And up until that point, there was a sense that this was called Madeline's War, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright's war, because the president was not taking a very active and direct role in kind of leading this conflict. The 50th anniversary of NATO transpires, and at that moment, it kind of becomes crystallizes. It's very clear that this conflict represents a key challenge for NATO going into the 21st century. And if NATO can sustain this military effort, see it through to a successful outcome, that will be a huge positive shot in the arm for NATO going forward into a new century.
And that just struck me as so fascinating because despite this kind of tepid political commitment up prior to the summit, you identify that post-war planning began for this a year in advance. Is that right?
Yes, there were, and this kind of builds on the experience in Bosnia previously, where there was a sense that, okay, we need to start looking ahead on this. There are so many ways that this could unravel. We don't know exactly what the next steps will be. We don't know if there will be an overt military campaign or how this is going to develop, but we have to look to the long term, to some kind of sustainable outcome. And so just, it's really quite remarkable, the contrast with subsequent conflicts where overwhelmingly we focus on the initial military campaign. Here in Kosovo, you see a very different situation where we're focused from the beginning on what will happen next, what next. And I think that's a huge contributing factor in helping to achieve that reasonably tolerable outcome.
Yeah. So, the next two cases that you address are these subsequent conflicts. And I think it's fruitful to discuss them together because, as you point out, it's difficult to understand the choices that were made, especially in terms of the resources, your third planning element, in Afghanistan without taking a look at Iraq at the same time. And the thing that strikes me about these two together is that you have almost opposite ends of the spectrum. As you outline in your book, in Afghanistan, we did not anticipate that we would ever be fighting there. And it was something that we were developing very much improvisationally and on the fly as we were developing this plan. Whereas in Iraq, this was a fight that this administration had been preparing for almost since their inauguration. Particularly some aspects, Rumsfeld and some of the others within the administration felt that at some point it was likely that they were going to need to fight this fight, and they had been conducting this planning. So I have two very different planning horizons, and yet I have almost equally destructive outcomes in the post-war environment. So talk to us a little bit about how these two things were alike, how they were different, and how they interacted with each other.
Yeah, I think that's spot on, and I think it's in a way it's quite unsettling that you have these two different scenarios that both came to outcomes that were, we'll say, suboptimal, to put it charitably. So in the case of Afghanistan, obviously this is not something, as you just suggested, not something the U.S. has been planning for any duration. The surprise and the shock of 9/11 spurs us into action. And the U.S. now has enormous freedom of action to do almost anything it might like to do, or at least to attempt anything it might like to do in Afghanistan, due to enormous domestic political capital, international sympathy, NATO invoking Article 5 for the first time in its history, and so forth. And so the fundamental question that arises in Afghanistan, and then again arises in Iraq, is, okay, what comes next? We topple the Taliban, and then later we topple Saddam. What comes next? Are we going to create a kind of a weak central government? In the case of Afghanistan, perhaps we might leverage U.S.-friendly warlords and kind of disperse the power and just be content with that. Not necessarily democracy per se, but just be content with some type of arrangement like that might be stable. Or are we going to remake Afghanistan into a centralized democracy? We really never directly answer that question. And we have different parts of the U.S. government in different ways trying to kind of pursue both at the same time. And one hand's not talking to the other, and we're kind of undercutting different parts of the government as we do that. And of course, as this is unfolding, we pop the champagne and pretty quickly start shifting focus to Iraq, where again, we encounter very similar challenges. Are we going to create a democracy, go all in Iraq and build something that we would see as analogous to, post-war Germany or Japan or South Korea? Or are we going to hand off the keys to somebody like Ahmad Chalabi and just let him run with it? And if it's a democracy, fine. But hey, if it's not a democracy and he's kind of a Hosni Mubarak type of figure and he's just, an ally or a partner of the U.S., that's fine too. We never answer those core questions. And so we end up with this very incoherent approach. We articulate very maximalist aims, but apply minimal resources. And this is infused with the pathologies I mentioned a few minutes ago, particularly to include wishful thinking, the idea that Hamid Karzai in the case of Afghanistan, Ahmad Chalabi in the case of Iraq. This is kind of our white knight in shining armor. You're going to go in there and just allow us to back out very quickly, have a great outcome, and everything's going to be great, and just watch. And this is really problematic and helps lead to the undoing in both of those conflicts.
I was really struck by that you identified in both cases that the wishful thinking very much coalesced around these figures. And these figures were very congenial to Western leaders because they spoke good English. They had backgrounds in the West. They did these things, but as we learned to our detriment, they did not have the depth of support that they represented themselves as having within the diverse communities that mattered in their home countries. And I guess I'm curious, in neither Kosovo nor in the next example we'll discuss, Libya, was there an analogous figure like a Karzai or a Chalabi who U.S. policymakers could pin their hopes and dreams on in the same way. And I'm curious if you think that had there been, that we might have been subject to some of the same faults in those instances as we were in Iraq and Afghanistan. In other words, are we too eager to look for that white knight?
I think it's not just about the person. And I think Karzai and Chalabi are both important in their own ways. But I think at the end of the day, it's not just about finding a particular person. It's about this notion of finding a simple answer to a complex set of questions. And if you can pin it on a person, great. If you can pin it on some other entity or element or figure or whoever that might be, that also works fine. But at the end of the day, the kind of magical thinking component of this is being able to find an easy answer, an easy button, and to say, aha, this is our answer. And in some ways, it wasn't just that person. It was infused with other aspects as well. For example, the idea of oil revenue. Oil revenue is going to help finance the reconstruction. The people are going to welcome us with open arms, and just watch. It's going to be great. So it's, yes, Karzai and Chalabi I think are important, absolutely. But that was one piece of this whole equation in which we're trying to find simple answers to very complex questions and basically sidestep the need to make hard decisions and come up with a coherent post-war strategy.
So one of the other pathologies that you identify, of course, is the underutilization or improper utilization of the National Security Council. And in the case of both Afghanistan and Iraq, it's clear that the NSC was a sideshow to the power structure residing within the Department of Defense. And one of the things that struck me again in both examples was the degree to which DoD exercised a veto over the solutions proposed by state, but at the same time wanted no part of the post-war planning. And I'm curious, do you have any insight into why DoD wanted to make this decision, but then didn't want to be any part of it? And I would think that they would have been more than happy to push that decision off onto state and then kind of wipe their hands of it.
Well, I think at the time, if we put ourselves back at that moment, we have to think about some of the power players. So Rumsfeld has tremendous power behind the scenes in the administration. And he also has a very powerful ally in the vice president, Dick Cheney. The kind of Cheney-Rumsfeld alliance, if you will, has huge power behind the scenes and helps to quiet down the efforts of Colin Powell and others, to include the efforts of Condoleezza Rice to try to get some kind of coherence to this effort. And so I think Rumsfeld, as you indicate, he's trying to pull the strings to get the Pentagon's fingerprints all over the post-war. But at the same time, that it's not an effort to stay for a long duration. It's an effort to make sure that we just quickly hand off the keys, get out of there, and then shift focus to somewhere else. Rumsfeld had no inclination to stay in Afghanistan or in Iraq for any long duration of time. He had written and talked repeatedly about his severe distaste for the whole idea of nation building. But it's ironic because the president himself repeatedly spoke of the virtues of implanting a new democracy in these places. So you have the president verbally aspiring for certain things, but his very powerful Secretary of Defense, who had a key controlling role in all of this, trying to pivot in a very different direction.
The other thing that really struck me in the Iraq example in particular was the bureaucratic distribution and finger pointing about who or what was even responsible for figuring out what the problems was. And you've got this wonderful thing talking about the Executive Steering Group, Joint Task Force 4, Joint Staff J5 having a Iraq political military cell, then the Office of Humanitarian Reconstruction and Assistance, or Reconstruction and Humanitarian Assistance rather. So you've got how many different organizations finger pointing, every one of them, by the way, also convinced that they are an ad hoc interim organization because, as you said, this problem is going to take care of itself and go away. So how did that play out?
Yeah, well, the short answer is it didn't play out well. So, exactly like you said, there were a whole array of different entities that had some kind of involvement in looking at or planning for post-war Iraq. So, the layperson or the casual observer might think that, oh, maybe we messed up post-war Iraq because we just didn't plan for it. That's really not the case. I found very clearly in my research that there was a tremendous amount of planning that was happening in all these different agencies and organizations that were created on an ad hoc basis. The problem is they weren't nested. There was no coherence. Every element is marching in a different direction. And it's just a very deeply muddled view of what could or should happen next. And really, in some ways, it stems from the very muddled decision to even invade Iraq in the first place. Because if you were to ask, say, a dozen Americans, even today, why do you think we invaded Iraq in the first place? You might get a dozen different answers. And so if you have kind of a confused perspective on why we're invading a given country in the first place, then when it comes to what happens next, that there's a good chance that may be equally muddy as well. And you have all these different entities doing different things, and there's no coherence to it.
Yeah, and it occurs to me that amid all those groups that I just named, I left off, of course, the one that winds up being the most enduring of them, the Coalition Provisional Authority, which was responsible for execution of the post-war planning such as it was. So, and the fact that came up following the Iraqi Interim Authority and following the ORHA and following all these other groups, it just.
Yeah, and I would just say on that, the CPA of all the alphabet soup of different entities that you mentioned there, the CPA is probably the one that people recognize and remember the most. The CPA does get and Ambassador Paul Bremer do get blame for what unfolded, but I think it's unfair to put all the blame on them. Bremer and his team there were, again, just another one of these ad hoc organizations put together at the 11th hour. And yes, they absolutely made mistakes. The de-Baathification edict and edict to dissolve the Iraqi security forces, those were certainly mistakes. But it was really just a culmination of the whole series of mistakes leading up to that point and the overall just lack of a coherent strategy.
When we discuss Iraq and Afghanistan, we can't avoid the strength of the personalities of some of the players you've mentioned: Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Feith, Powell, and President Bush. And it might be easy to conclude that there was something unique about their worldview or their approach to problems that caused these failures. And then we get to your last case, Libya, where none of those players are in power anymore. And yet, as you point out, the results are hardly satisfactory. Tell us about this one.
Yeah, this is what's really fascinating. So if it were just a story about Afghanistan and Iraq, then potentially you could explain this away by saying, well, maybe this one administration was just kind of uniquely messed up in some ways, or just had unique dynamics that were occurring that allowed this to unfold. But the fact that now you have a totally different administration coming next, and to make matters more interesting, it was an administration that had explicitly campaigned on a platform of how badly we had kind of messed up the war in Iraq. Now that administration falls into similar pitfalls in terms of magical thinking, in terms of not coming up with a coherent strategy. That makes this, I think, all the more unsettling. And the echoes with Iraq are really quite interesting. I think, again, in the case of Libya, as had occurred in Iraq, there's this idea that, hey, we can rely on these Libyan exiles. There's a belief that the oil revenue in Libya will help pave the way forward. This idea that in the wake of the Arab Spring, that we can just give a little push to the dictator and all will go smoothly and democracy will take hold. And this is a positive, transformative moment that's going to unleash democracy throughout the Middle East. Again, not that different from what the previous administration had been thinking about and projecting back in 2003 in Iraq.
Yeah, and you talk about both in the Bush administration and in the Obama administration, the impact of what you refer to as negative lessons learned on the pathology of deficient learning. How does that work?
Yeah, so I think in both cases, they are not exploring, I think, the full range of potential post-conflict situations that would have been very helpful for them. So in the case of the Bush administration, there's this acronym that becomes prevalent of ABC, which is anything but Clinton. So they are not going to entertain anything that has any whiff of being associated with the Clinton administration. So the learning, what I talked about earlier, the learning from the school of hard knocks of all these 1990s interventions that culminated in Kosovo, essentially gets relegated to the dustbin of history. And there's this idea that, hey, that was all pre-9/11 stuff. It's tainted by the Clinton administration. Now we're in a brand new era. This is the post-9/11 era. And it's a whole new set of rules. It's a whole new world. And we're going to use our power as we see fit. And we're going to make up new rules as we go. That's kind of the idea as the Bush administration is coming in. And then as the Obama administration comes in, again, the things that are associated with the Bush administration have a negative stigma attached to them. And so there were absolutely significant blunders that are made in some of these conflicts. But I think you can also look through and at least select a few reasonable course corrections that were made as well. But that also gets essentially flushed out. And unfortunately, the Obama administration, in seeking to swing the pendulum in a different direction, swings it all the way in the opposite direction and ends up in a very similar, unfortunate situation.
So I was struck because one of the criticisms of the Obama administration in terms of their approach to national security has been the degree to which power was centralized in the National Security Council. And, one of the pathologies you identify is not using the National Security Council enough. And yet, even in an administration that is infamous for perhaps overuse of the NSC, we still find that it wasn't effective. What was the role of the NSC with Libya, and where did it go off the rails if it did?
Well, I think in the Obama administration, the NSC swells in size. It grows significantly larger. It becomes more involved in what you would refer to as operational types of decisions, as opposed to, I'd say, broader strategic considerations. Leon Panetta, this Secretary of Defense during part of the Libya conflict, likens the situation to being the driver of an automobile, but finding that the wheel and the transmission, nothing actually works. You're just sitting in the vehicle, but not actually in charge. That's kind of what some of the cabinet secretaries felt at the time, was that the decision making was centralized really in the president and his inner circle. But although the NSC was very large in size, you had a lot of people there. There wasn't actual true debate that arrived at meaningful strategic decisions that occurred there. It was more of a kind of perfunctory check the block kind of aspect, but the real decision making was relegated to the president and his inner circle. And so the real strategic questions that could and should have been grappled with by the NSC, that really didn't happen.
So, much as in Iraq and Afghanistan, you had tension between DOD and the Department of State, you had tension again in the Libya situation with state, and especially with some at the UN delegation and the National Security Advisor, who felt strongly about the Libya intervention, but Secretary of Defense Bob Gates was not a fan. How did that affect our ability to implement post-war planning? Yeah,
Secretary of Defense Gates was not a fan. He was one of the dozens of interviews I was privileged to be able to conduct as part of this, as part of the research for this project. He was not a fan. He mentioned to me that he stated in multiple meetings, and this is included in the book, but he said, hey, before we start a third war, can we at least, close out the two wars we've already got underway first, meaning the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. He was very concerned about the possibility that we would not think through this intervention, that it would result in a slippery slope, and that we wouldn't think through the end state. And in fact, that's more or less what unfolded. And so you had him and some of the senior military officials who were not even remotely enthusiastic about waging this campaign in the first place, and then others who were more inclined to do it. But at the end of the day, nobody really takes ownership of the post-war piece of this. And so there is planning that's conducted there. And I discuss how there is this task force that's created called the post-Q, as in post-Gaddafi task force. They come up with a whole series of what-if scenarios. What if Gaddafi flees? What if Gaddafi remains in power? What if there's some kind of power sharing agreement? All of these what-ifs. But they have no real authority or leverage to do anything with all of these plans. And so they just kind of sit there and languish on the shelf. And one day Gaddafi is gone. He's out of the picture. And there's no real coherent strategy for what comes next.
So at the conclusion of your book, when you've looked at these 4 cases, you identify about 7 lessons that we should take from it. And a couple of these we've discussed consistently: to beware of magical thinking, to learn from history instead of exhibiting deficient learning, to empower the NSC. What are some of the other lessons that you identified as you went through here?
Yeah, I think one of them is avoiding check the block planning. So in other words, we may come up in some cases with a quote unquote post-war plan, but really one that only addresses contingencies in the immediate aftermath. So for example, a humanitarian crisis, refugee issues, and so forth. That's all important, but it doesn't really get at the long-term post-war way ahead. And so in a situation like that, the military and civilian leadership might be tempted to say, yes, Mr. President, we have our post-war plan. We are good to go. But in fact, it might only address, say, the first 60 or 90 days after the regime is toppled, and not deal with everything after that. So that's one. Another lesson, and arguably I would say, maybe the most important lesson of all of them, is the need to be highly selective in deciding when to topple a regime in the first place. All of this planning and the strategizing is difficult. It may sound easy, but it is extremely difficult. The odds are almost always going to be stacked against success from the outset. And we're not going to create a democracy on the cheap in almost every situation. And so the importance of being selective and choosing when to go to war in the first place is absolutely vital. We've been relatively frequently engaging these wars over the past generation without very good outcomes. And I think it just highlights the need to be more selective in the future.
Yeah, that's definitely it's sad that it's a lesson that you have to be explicit about. But yeah, if there's anything to take from the last 2 decades of use of military force, it's that we often underestimate and are insufficiently reflective about the costs, financial, political, and human, of a choice to use force, and especially when it involves changing a regime. At the end of your book, you also identify a number of myths, and I won't go through all of them. Most of them, as I was reading along, I was nodding my head in agreement. But there was one in there that struck me as a little bit interesting, and it was that you said, it busts the myth that post-war planning is just the military's job. And I guess my thought was I had never heard that as a myth. I wasn't thinking that people had that perception, but it really raised for me the question of what is the balance between civilian leadership, the Department of State, and the military, particularly when we get into issues that are as fraught and political as the choice of war aims and how it is that we're going to proceed in this environment. How do we hit that balance?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. I think it comes back to the importance of the National Security Council. I think the National Security Council is the one entity that has at least some chance of being able to fuse and bring these disparate elements together. I think hitting the easy button would be to think that, oh, yeah, the military can take this. The military's got it. They can take the post-war piece of it. But the military, they can certainly take the lead in the security component, but you have a political component to this, economic components. This is really, use an overused term, the whole of government type of challenge. And I would suggest that the National Security Council is best equipped to be able to bring these different departments and agencies and entities together to find a coherent way forward.
Folks who know Brendan will know that he is an enormous fan of cinema as well as of TV. And one of my favorite passages in the conclusion of the book, you say, in a classic 1993 episode of The Simpsons, Sideshow Bob steps on a rake. The handle flips up and hits him in the face. Sideshow Bob adjusts his path and steps on another rake with a similar result. He then forges ahead again and again and ultimately gets struck in the face 9 times, oblivious to the fact that rakes litter the ground all around him. This scenario bears an uncanny resemblance to our actions in recent wars. So I love this passage. Anytime you can incorporate The Simpsons into a serious analysis of policy, it's great. But I bring it up also because as a serving Army officer, writing a critique of U.S. policy that draws this type of comparison, however apt, is a challenge. How has your book been received in the Army?
Overwhelmingly, I've gotten positive feedback. I think there is an acknowledgement among my fellow service members that you can't escape the conclusion that Iraq and Afghanistan have not gone according to plan. That I think is quite apparent. And so I think in effort to grapple with the lessons, or at least some of the lessons from these conflicts, I think I think it's understood that this can and should contribute to the overall discourse on this topic as we forge the way ahead. That's not to say that the next wars that our nation is involved in will look exactly like Afghanistan and Iraq. They probably will be different in some meaningful ways, but we have to be able to draw important lessons learned from these conflicts, and I think there's an acknowledgement of that amongst professional service members.
And that, I think, leads to a good concluding question is, I think you have a really good analysis with tremendous insight from people who were involved. And in retrospect, it's comparatively obvious to both those who were involved and those who simply have observed it in history that it didn't go well. But no one involved in those choices set out to do poorly. No one involved in those choices set out to engage in magical thinking. No one set out to engage in deficient learning. No one set out to sidetrack the NSC or to get caught up in what you describe as maximalist ends with minimalist means. So if I'm a policymaker and I'm making a choice about the use of force, how do I know if I'm going down the bad road?
Well, I think you frame it the right way, that these policymakers and officials involved here, they're not irrational, they're not incompetent people. They're by and large patriotic Americans who believe in our country, believe in our Constitution. They're trying to do the right things, and end up going down a bad path. I think that there's no cookie cutter answer to how to circumvent all of this, but I think at the end of the day, it comes back to asking foundational questions about why are we looking to embark on a given conflict, and then what's going to happen next. If we can't develop good, convincing, coherent answers to some of those very basic questions, then that is probably the first important indicator that we are going down a bad track.
I think the final words of your book say it very well. We can and must make better choices. Continuing along the course of spiraling chaos is simply unthinkable. Whether we can learn from our past, while seeing the realities hiding in plain sight, will almost certainly shape how the next chapters of history unfold. And I think your book makes a great contribution for understanding that past in a way that evaluates it on the basis of policy choices, not on the basis of partisan positions or preferences, and that illuminates the places where we started stepping off of a path that would have led to success. And I think it does a great service in doing that.
Yeah, I think there could be potentially a temptation to try to forget about these conflicts, to try to block them out and pretend like they never happened. I would suggest that that would be extremely unfortunate if that were to occur. I think we need to learn from these events. and they can help inform us as we go forward to hopefully make better decisions in the future.
So we've been talking with Brendan Gallagher, a career infantry officer and Princeton PhD whose book, The Day After, Why America Wins the War But Loses the Peace, was recently published by Cornell University Press. Thanks so much for joining us, Brendan.
Thank you, Doyle. I appreciate it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.